So, based on what we talked about regarding the family structure along the matrilineal lines, we understand that our first important social unit was the family. And they always maintained the integrity of the circle. But what happened when society started to grow? Because we know they did, right? They would become successful based on this structure. They were able to create sustainable outcomes, which led to growth of population. How did they maintain the circular structure politically? That's the important point that we want to make, especially when we understand that they had to grow. Well, why did they have to grow? It's not just that they were growing because they were successful, but they had to grow. Well, based on the circular family unit and based on what we were able to observe as humans back then, we began to understand very quickly we needed to diversify the gene pool. And we needed to bring in different people and include them in our circle. And I'll talk real briefly towards the end about some of the methodology for bringing people in and including them in the circle. But as the population began to grow, and we began to diversify the population, we understood we needed a slightly bigger political unit besides just the family. And so we grew, and we created a larger political unit known as the clan. The clan was crucial, and sometimes we even divided ourselves up under different clans to ensure diversity of the gene pool. And as we grew even bigger, we decided to become tribes. And the example I'm going to give here in just a second got so large that it actually needed to create a league of tribes. But before we get into all of that, we want to talk real quickly. How did people make choices and decisions? What type of leadership was there? We already discussed that matrilineal does not mean matriarchal. It's not that the women of the family unit were just standing around giving orders, making choices without taking other people's interests into account. That's not what matrilineal is. So how were choices made? Well, one of the readings you all had regarded, again, the observable world. It was about the African landscape. And a certain term had come up in there, and the term was natural democracy. Based on what humans were able to observe, again, regardless of what part of the planet they were on, they saw a natural democracy in the way the world operated. One of the examples that's in that reading was ant colonies. What we see, of course, is if we observe how the world works, whether it's ant colonies, whether it's prides of lions, that everything is crucial to the survival of everything else. That there is an inherent web in how various organisms survive. And humans began to understand this too. And they began to apply the idea of natural democracy to their political organization. So we're going to use an example from a different continent. We're going to go to North America, and we're going to use the example of the Iroquois League of Peace and Power. Now, Iroquois, of course, is a French term. That's what the French called them when they observed them. The correct term, and excuse my pronunciation, would be Haudenosaunee. But regardless, for our purposes here, for simplicity's sake, we'll refer to it as Iroquois, and we'll divide this up in just a moment. But one of the things that Europeans observed when they would watch the Iroquois in action, and these Europeans, of course, at the time, if we're talking about the 15, 16, 1700s, they all came from very differently structured societies. Their societies at this point in time were very patriarchal. They had extreme hierarchy. At this point in time, they also all lived in monarchies. So what they were observing was actually quite novel to them. Even though it's highly likely, if we go back far enough in time, their societies were probably structured very similarly. But the family unit is crucial. Natural democracy in the family essentially means that any major choice, whether it is planting a new crop, changing hunting grounds, setting up a trade network with a rival group, Or if we're talking about the 15, 16, 1700s, how to interact with these new people that have got off on boats along your coast, all of these choices would be made at the family level in these decisions. And it would be the matrons that would bring everybody together and they would have a discussion. And that discussion would ultimately come to a conclusion. And that conclusion then had to be agreed upon in most cases, not all cases. It actually began to change as Europeans became more impatient with this process. But originally, it would have to be a unanimous decision. This is important. That means every voice was heard. Now, again, if we reflect back to what human beings were observing, why would every voice need to be heard? Well, again, whether we're talking about ant colonies, whether we're talking about prides of lions, whether we're talking about even the way plants develop, every voice actually matters. They're all crucial to keep this web, this network of survival, of perpetuation of life intact. So the family unit operated the same way. Essentially, a discussion would take place, arguments would be made, and ultimately a unanimous decision would happen. The matrons would then select the person who had the best argument to take this argument to the next level, especially in these larger groups. And in this case, we now see where gender division of labor comes in. Even though it's the matrons that select the person that will take the argument, that person was most often a male because it was his job to go out, of course, into the wilderness and represent the best or the goodwill of this group. Now, to use the specific terminology from this point in time, the Iroquois society, they called these representatives oftentimes sachems. And they would take this up to the next level, and the process would repeat itself. Arguments, discussions, all types of things would take place until a unanimous decision was reached. If a unanimous decision was not reached, and there was strong disagreement, the sachems would come back down to the family level, and they would do it all over again. Now, of course, this took a very long time. And that's okay, because we already know that these societies, based on your readings, didn't even think of time in the same way that we do. So they weren't in a hurry to make these choices. They thought of time in terms of cycles. They knew that the same situation or the same decision would come back around anyway. This is important because when in our specific to our colonial example here, this slowly transitioned as the Iroquois felt the pressure of the impatience of European society at the time. They were already thinking of time in terms of linear processes. And we'll get to that in the next unit. But what it does do is it puts a lot of pressure on this system in place. It's also important to note that this would repeat itself all the way up to the league level. And again, to use the Iroquois example, there were 3 different clans, wolf, turtle, and bear. And then we move up to the tribal level, of which there were 5 and later eventually 6 tribes. Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, and Onondaga, and later on Tuscarora. And eventually, of course, we get to the league level, the League of Peace and Power. And I'm using this example specifically because you're about to watch another video about an important narrative that helps perpetuate understanding of this. It creates an ethically constitutive narrative that gets people to want to subscribe to this type of political organization. It's about the Daganoweda epic. And again, excuse my pronunciation.